Okay, it's all yours.
Okay, well, thank you all very, very much for showing up. And it's nice to be able to establish a link across the Potomac from Chevy Chase down to Arlington. And it is my pleasure to um, have the opportunity to meet with all of you and to chat about my new book, which is right here. It's called A Different Russia, Khrushchev and Kennedy on a Collision Course. And that guy over here, that's me, a photograph taken in Moscow 67 years ago. Um, Now, the hair was dark then, it's a little lighter now, but we can't do anything about that. One of the good things, the connection between then and now, is that there's going to be a Russia in our lives, whether we like it or not. It is simply part of the globe, and it extends over 9 time zones, from the Baltic in the west to the Pacific in the east, and it's been around a very long time. So let's imagine for just a moment that there is no Putin and there is no Ukraine war, and then there will still be a Russia and there will still be a United States of America. And the key for both sides is going to be understanding each other and trying to get along. Because if both are going to be there for a long time, there will inevitably be conflicts of one sort or another, not necessarily military, but political, economic, ideological, but conflicts there will be. How we resolve those conflicts is absolutely central. China is very big too, but it always ends up being this balance between Russia on one side, the United States on the other. It was my pleasure and professional responsibility to cover the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. And as I look around at the various pictures here, I am gathering that you are all young enough to remember the Cold War, and you remember how difficult things were. And I'm sure many of you remember Berlin crises, and you certainly remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was in Moscow during all of that time. I was there from 1956 until 1963. There were a couple of times when we take a break and we went back to the US, but that period of time was the beginning of the Cold War, and it really could be argued that it was the hottest, most dangerous, darkest times in the Cold War. We came perilously close to having a nuclear war over Cuba in October 1962. When I arrived there in 1956, however, that was the start of what would become three memoirs. The first one that came out in 1958, but was written earlier and dependent on the time 1956, was called The Year I Was Peter the Great. Got a story about that. The second book took me from 1957 to 1960, when Edward R. Murrow, whom many of you I'm sure will remember, hired me to go to Moscow and to be CBS correspondent at that time in Moscow, and I remained there then for 3 straight years. Why did Murrow send me? Because I spoke Russian. I had taught Russian history. I knew about Russian literature. And he wanted somebody who was not simply going to be there to cover the day-to-day news, but someone who might be able to bring some perspective to the news as well. Um, that second book that I did, a second memoir, was called Assignment Russia. and the third one based upon the period from
Oh, God, it never
1961,
ends.
62, 63. I want to start with my story on why I was
It
called
just
Peter the Great.
never ends.
Somebody, please put
Yeah,
yourself on mute.
I'm trying to. There we go. I think that's it. Okay.
Okay, I'll go on. In At the July 4th party in Moscow in 1956, Ambassador Charles Bolin, who was an outstanding American ambassador, was a terrific guy, very professional, first rate, spoke Russian like a native. But there were only four people at the embassy at that time who actually spoke Russian, which is very hard to imagine because today almost everybody based in Moscow speaks the language. At that time, we had four people. It was the ambassador, his two principal aides, and me, a young guy of 26, um, who spoke Russian because he picked it up in college and graduate school. And the ambassador, the ambassador thought of me as his kid, as the guy who sharpened pencils, who would occasionally serve as an attaché dealing with the American press corps, who would occasionally translate the Soviet press. I did whatever the ambassador wanted. And on this particular occasion, he did not know whether Nikita Khrushchev would show up for the July 4th party until the evening of July 3rd, when he got word from the Kremlin that, yes, for the first time, a Russian leader was going to show up at a July 4th party. It was a big deal. It was Khrushchev's way of saying, let's try to get along. But who was going to look after Marshal Zhukov? He was the great World War II military leader, the Battle of Stalingrad, the Battle of Leningrad. He was a great historic figure. He was about 5'6" in height and width, and he had an appetite which was legendary, and a drinking habit which was legendary. And it occurred to me, the ambassador says to me, Marvin, when they arrive, you are going to look after Marshal Zhukov. I had been a PFC in the United States Army. I thought there was an idiotic asymmetry between a marshal in the Soviet Army and a PFC in the American Army, now serving as an attaché. And so I tried to figure out what I could do. And one of the things I knew was that I didn't drink vodka. And I turned to a man who served as the butler at the ambassador's residence where the party was taking place. He was a Chinese by birth. I was absolutely convinced he was in the intelligence service of at least five other governments. But he did work for Ambassador Bolden too. And I said, Tom, what am I going to do? I don't drink. And he said, I'll take care of it. And he set up a tray and he put vodka on the outside, pointing it at the marshal. And on the inside was water. And they both looked alike. And so the marshal came in. I went over, I introduced myself. I invited him to come to the beautifully set up backyard at Spaso House. There was a table there with lots of hot dogs and lots of beer and lots of vodka for those who wanted it. Well, I sort of turned my back for a moment and he had already sucked down two hot dogs and he looked around for vodka. And Tang mercifully appeared at that point, pointing his tray of vodka toward him. And he picked up one and belted it back, picked up a second and belted it back. I picked up water and belted it back. He was under the assumption we were both drinking vodka. What happened after about a half hour was he got a little woozy, not a lot, just a little bit. But in his mind, in his eye, I was drinking with him. And he wanted to share this news with Khrushchev. Khrushchev was there in his usual ebullient, excited way. He was talking with the ambassador, and Zhukov and I approached him. And Zhukov said, "Nikita Sergeyevich, I have finally found a young American who can drink like a Russian." Khrushchev burst into laughter. He thought that was really fantastic. And I knew my little secret, and the ambassador did as well. And Khrushchev approached me, and he too was about 5'6". And he looked up, I was 6'3". And he said, "How tall are you?" And an inspiration hit me. And I said, "I'm 3 centimeters shorter than Peter the Great." Well, that put him into stitches of laughter. And there's a secret here. Whenever a dictator laughs, all of the people around him also laugh. So he began to laugh, everybody began to laugh, and I was thereby christened Peter the Great, which was terrific when I came back in 1959 for CBS. I had a kind of access to Khrushchev that the other reporters did not have. I want to be clear about this. There were no favorites. I knew no secrets or anything like that. But I was a young, ambitious CBS reporter, and I wanted to get as close to the guy who's making news as possible. And as Peter the Great, I was able to do that. I was able to get a couple of exclusives. And when I arrived there as the CBS correspondent in 1960, I did have that advantage. And I played it to the hilt. Whenever I had an opportunity to get close to Khrushchev with a microphone, I was able to get an interview with him. He was, at one occasion when I approached him, his 2 bodyguards, 2 guys who were with him at all times, reached into their jacket pockets for weapons because they did not know me. Khrushchev did, and he shouted at them, "Easy does it, easy does it. Here comes Peter the Great." And so that advantage that I have really was terrific and stayed with me the whole time that I was in Russia through 1963. In January of 61, you will all remember that John Kennedy took the oath of office on January 20th. When Kennedy took the oath of office, it was already clear since his election the prior November, Khrushchev wanted a summit meeting with him. Khrushchev had been very unhappy with President Eisenhower, and he figured that this young, attractive, very energetic American president is going to be the guy for him to deal with. And so he wanted this summit. Until the summit happened, and it actually did in June of 1961, a number of things were happening that put certain ideas into Khrushchev's head. The first thing that happened was in February of 61, when in the Congo, Africa, the leader was a very left-wing, but not necessarily communist, man named Lumumba. Some of you may remember the name. In Khrushchev's mind, Lumumba was going to be what Castro was already proving to be in Latin America. Lumumba would be his foot into Africa. And what happened was that John Kennedy and the Belgian government, working with the UN, intercepted that Soviet power move into Central Africa. and Lumumba was killed. He was actually murdered. And when he was, Khrushchev regarded that almost as John Kennedy playing dirty pool. He should not have gone after my guy in Africa, but Kennedy did. And Kennedy did that to protect American interest and to intercept the flow of Soviet weapons and supplies into Africa. It was a big US victory in that sense. 2 months later, in April, you all remember the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. That was a total disaster on Kennedy's part, total disaster. Khrushchev, thinking back to the Lumumba experience and deciding in his mind that he was going to get Kennedy, but at the same time, he wanted to have deals with Kennedy. He was split in the way in which he viewed his opportunities to deal with Kennedy. But he figured that any leader of the United States who would allow such a catastrophe, strategic and military, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, that was a young man who was weak and inexperienced. Those were the two words that Khrushchev used consistently to describe Kennedy. When the two of them met in Vienna, it was very hard to describe, really. It was a moment of incredibly high, totally unrealistic expectations about what the two leaders could accomplish in 2 days of talks. And when it was all over, the 2 days of talks, it ended on a downbeat, a very decided downbeat. And if you give me a moment, just let me just read a paragraph here, which will give you some sense of what it was like at the very end of the summit in June 1961. Like a red light warning, the word miscalculation ignited an ugly exchange between the two leaders in the closing minutes, leaving both fearful of a new confrontation over Berlin. Berlin was the hot issue, the division of Berlin. With only minutes left before their final handshake, Kennedy again fell back on the danger of miscalculation. Unknown to us then, but officially disclosed many years later, Khrushchev erupted. Miscalculation, miscalculation, miscalculation. All I ever hear is that damn word, miscalculation. You ought to take that word and bury it in cold storage and never use it again. I'm sick of it. Losing his temper, which he often did when he felt trapped, Khrushchev exclaimed, "If the US wants war, then so be it." Kennedy let a minute pass before he coolly replied, "Then it's going to be a cold winter." And it was. And it was marked by a number of, hang on one sec. Within a month or two after the Vienna summit ended, Khrushchev decided that he would begin to take action on Berlin. Many of you will remember that the date, perhaps not, but on August 13th, 1961, Khrushchev began to build, you forgive me, I've got to, Khrushchev began to build a wall through the middle of Berlin. That was a clear violation of World War II agreements. The world, for a moment, felt that it could topple into a war between the US and the USSR. again, Khrushchev was looking for signs of additional weakness on Kennedy's part, and he found it. Because what we learned at the time as reporters, Dan Shore, another CBS reporter based in Berlin, went into East Germany, and I went into different parts of Russia. We both came up with the same result. If the United States had, early on, after the wall was being built, knocked it down, Khrushchev would have done nothing, because he knew that the United States was much stronger militarily, and he did not want to begin a war that he would lose. So he would have pulled back if the US had knocked the wall down. But Kennedy did not. And in Khrushchev's mind, that was an additional sign of weakness. The following year, in May of 1962, Khrushchev finally reached his decision to move against Cuba. And in moving against Cuba, he brought the world perilously close to a nuclear war. It is very hard when you look back upon that critical week in October of 1962. What had happened at that time, many of us, well informed though we might have been, did not know how perilously close we actually came. And I can tell you, as I think I am, but I'm really not sure about this, in my reporting on the Cuban Missile Crisis in this book, A Different Russia, you were getting the first reporting and discussion from Moscow by an American correspondent. And I can tell you that during that week, no one had much sleep. And on Monday of that week, when Kennedy chose to reveal to the world that the United States knew that the Soviet Union had moved tens of thousands of troops and many nuclear-tipped medium-range missiles into Cuba. Kennedy on Monday night, 7 p.m., I sort of remember it as if it were last night, Kennedy delivered this very forceful speech in which he imposed a quarantine of Cuba. And if Khrushchev wanted to challenge the quarantine, we would have stopped them, and there would have been shooting between the two sides. But the following day, on Tuesday, we learned that Khrushchev had in fact issued an order stopping all Soviet ships heading toward Cuba, not to return to Russia, but just stop in the water where they were. On Tuesday night, I have to tell you this story because it gives a sense of what was on Khrushchev's mind. On that Tuesday night, which I will never forget, my dear wife had tickets to the opera. Jerome Hines, an American opera star, was singing Boris Godunov that night at the Bolshoi Theater. And I told my dear wife that it was impossible for me to leave the office. We're in the middle of this incredible crisis. And she said, we're going. And I have learned over the years to agree. And so we went to the opera. What was extraordinary is when the lights went down, on the right in a special booth, suddenly there appeared Khrushchev and 4 members of the Communist Politburo. I was in the 4th row and I was looking at him about 20 feet away. And I said to my wife, how did you know this? Well, she didn't. But there was the story. Khrushchev showed up to pay his respects to an American artist on the 2nd day of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And because of this Peter the Great relationship, when the opera was over, Khrushchev led 4 standing ovations and then went backstage to talk to the opera star and his wife. And my wife and I went along with them. And because of this funny relationship, they let me through. And I went through, and there were 6 of us in the room, and I couldn't help it. And I turned to Khrushchev and I said, we're in the middle of this incredible crisis. Are we going to get out of it peacefully? And he said, when people want peace, they can get it. I said, in your judgment, do both sides want peace? And he said, yes. That was one hell of a big story that I had that Tuesday night. On Wednesday, Russell, Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher, left wing, he pleaded for a summit meeting between Kennedy and Khrushchev. They put that on the front page of Pravda, and that meant that Khrushchev supported the idea of a summit meeting. He wanted a deal. He was acknowledging indirectly that he had made a mistake in going into Cuba and he wanted out, but he wanted it with face, some honor. Well, there was no honor in that, in what he did. It was unacceptable. And when we got to Friday and Saturday of that week, the lights were dim indeed of any expectation of breaking through on the positive side. On that Sunday, October 28th, let me quickly tell you this story that I had my usual broadcast at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. In the morning, I went to the central marketplace, not to buy anything, but to talk to Russians, Russian farmers, Russian consumers, just engage them in conversation and try to find out what was on their mind. And what I learned very quickly was that they could not imagine a war between the US and Russia about Cuba. They kept on saying, that's so far away. Who needs it? They said, if there were an issue about Berlin, we would fight, but not about Cuba. It stuck in my mind, and it was the heart of a broadcast that I did at 3 in the afternoon. When I finished the broadcast, I bumped into a Russian journalist, a member of the Moscow radio staff. And I asked him at that time whether he knew anything, any new developments. And he said, listen at 5 o'clock. I said, why? He said, Levitan, and he fled. Levitan was the name of the #1 broadcaster. It was like Walter Cronkite in those days. And Levitan was the guy since World War II who would get on Moscow radio only when there was a major announcement. And I got a call to New York, and I told my boss, there may be a big story at 5 o'clock. I cannot guarantee it, but there may be, and I think we ought to have 2 lines between Moscow and New York. On one line, we will transmit, and you will tape in New York the Levitan, whatever it is that he said. And on the other line, I would do a voiceover translation of a phrase or 2 or a sentence that I thought was very significant. And so we set this up for 5 o'clock. At exactly 5 o'clock, I didn't hear a voice of the usual announcer saying, here's 5 o'clock and here's the news. It was Levitan. And he started by saying, he started by reading a letter from Khrushchev to Kennedy. And I did a translation over. So in New York, they were getting Levitan, and then on the other tape, they were getting me. And this first paragraph is the key. I continued my translation as best I could. Quote, in order to eliminate as rapidly as possible the conflict which endangers the cause of peace, to give an assurance to all people who crave peace, the Soviet government, in addition to earlier instructions on the discontinuation of further work on weapons construction sites. This was something that nobody on the outside of the Politburo knew. They had given an order before this letter was sent to Kennedy to dismantle the weapons sites. But none of us knew that at the time. And he went on. The Soviet government has given a new order to dismantle the arms which you describe as offensive and to crate and return them to the Soviet Union, unquote. I screamed. He caved. I think he just caved. My boss interjected, can we put out a bulletin? Yes, I shouted, but go no further than the quote I gave you about dismantling offensive weapons, crating them, returning them to the Soviet Union. For a little bit of time, CBS had one heck of an exclusive. But that was the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what it demonstrated was that Khrushchev, when cornered, was prepared to do something that the current Russian leader, Putin, would never do. Khrushchev publicly admitted a blunder and pulled out. And when he pulled out, the world was spared, and still is spared to this day, the horror of a nuclear war. There was a special relationship between Kennedy and Khrushchev, and the Cuban Missile Crisis bound them together in an odd way. They were the two leaders who were there at the very cusp of a nuclear war. One of them won, the other one lost, but in losing, saved the world. And when I say that, I'm not saying this to praise Khrushchev, because he's the one who got all of us into that mess to begin with. But unlike other Soviet leaders, and the reason this book to me is so special, the reason I'm calling it A Different Russia, is that essentially it was a different Russian leadership. And my message here is that it doesn't have to end horribly. The two of them, at the very end, will allow me just to read this concluding paragraph. Kennedy proved to be Khrushchev's last chance for a meaningful boost in Soviet-American relations. They met for one summit in Vienna in June 1961. After 2 days in the Austrian capital, Bloom replaced their earlier hopes for a radically improved relationship. Suspicions deepened as both leaders stumbled into dangerous miscalculations about Berlin and Cuba. Soon an ugly wall would be running through the divided German capital, and not too many months later, Khrushchev would foolishly decide to slip nuclear-tipped missiles into Cuba. Kennedy had once appealed to Khrushchev as a genuine partner for peace. He saw in the young president an adversary with whom he thought he could do business. For a brief time, 1 month on the 1963 calendar, shortly after signing the historic atmospheric nuclear test ban agreement with the United States, Khrushchev allowed himself to live in a beautiful bubble of hope. Every now and then, with his closest advisors, or family members, he would imagine 6 more years of other major US-Soviet agreements that would, among other things, control the spread of nuclear weapons, settle the Berlin crisis, and lead to a period of genuine peace. Why 6 years, he was asked. Well, he'd reply, Kennedy had 2 more years in his current term, and then another 4 in his next term, which Khrushchev felt certain he would win. What Khrushchev did not know, could not know, was that within 1 month, Kennedy would be dead, and within a year, he himself would be ousted from power. When Khrushchev heard Kennedy had been shot, he cried. His dreams for a new and glorious era in Soviet-American relations had just come to a tragic end. My conclusion, I alluded to a moment ago. What is central to all of us is the quality of our leadership, the quality of political leadership, both at home and abroad. And since the Soviet Union, now Russia, has more nuclear weapons than any other country on earth, including the United States, including China, Russia remains a strategic challenge to the United States. And there's nothing we can do. We cannot escape that fact. So imagine one day the Ukraine war will end. One day, who knows when, Putin will be out of power. When that time comes, there will still be a Russia, there will still be an America, and they will still have to find some way of getting along. I am open to your questions, if you have any.
All right, we do have a number of questions and comments. Back in the 50s and 60s, times were different than they are now, obviously. Were you ever concerned that you might be identified as a spy during your time in Moscow?
Yeah, absolutely. All foreigners were seen as spies of one sort or another. If you're a journalist, what is it that is your job? You're there to get information, and in my case, broadcast it. What does a real spy do? He tries to get information and doesn't broadcast it, of course, but sends it back to his home base. So in a Russian mind, and in a communist mind especially, all foreigners were there to get information that they did not want released, and therefore in their broad category, we were all spies. One of my dear friend, Nick Daniloff, who died recently, was actually arrested and held for a couple of weeks until the US under then Ronald Reagan tried to get Nick released and ultimately did. But yes, that was the problem, and that was why we were followed wherever we went. You go on a shopping trip, you wanted to buy something, there was always a KGB officer behind you. On one occasion, I love ice cream, and so I was downtown in Red Square, and there were these small stands, ice cream stands that went over to one. And on an instinct, I bought 2 ice cream cones. I started licking on one and simply handed it back like this. I didn't say a word. And the KGB guy took it, began to lick on his own thing, put a big smile on his face. And yeah, sometimes you did get arrested, sometimes you exchanged ice cream cones.
And that brought a comment here that Russian ice cream was wonderful. So
It
clearly you're
really
not the
was.
only fan.
Morozhnoye, that was one of the good things that Russia produced, ice cream.
We've got a couple of comments here about people's experiences with trying to keep up with the Russians when they're drinking. and they kind of echo yours. One said she doesn't drink, and certainly not vodka. So when she was there in the 90s, she had a sip, but no more. But always had a bottle of vodka in the freezer when Russian colleagues would come to visit. Um, and another person saying when he arrived in Moscow, the advice he got from the embassy staff was never try to keep up. You just can't. Take advantage of the food and the water, but don't try and keep up.
I think that's a very sensible bit of advice.
Yep.
I'm sure there are Americans who could drink as much as the Russians, but they simply have more experience at it. For example, if you were a Finn, the Finns drank a lot of vodka too, but they drank all kinds of things. So I would put a Finn up against a Russian as a drinker anytime.
You alluded to having picked up Russian in school. Is that how you learned it, or were you also traveling and learning through exposure?
Yeah, no, I learned Russian when I started to learn Russian when I was in college. I took a year's worth of Russian at that time. I barely cracked the top of the language. It's a hard language. But when I went to graduate school, I did 2 additional years of Russian language and one summer at Middlebury. Um, and by the time I went to Russia in 1956, I spoke Russian reasonably well, but clearly with an accent, clearly up and down in terms of grammar, misuse. But I could get by, and I understood much of what I was hearing. When I went back there then in the summer of 59, and then for a long stretch in May of 60, within a matter of a couple of months of daily use of the language, I got to be pretty good at it. And right now, I haven't spoken it in literally decades. But if I were back in Russia again, which I would love to be, um, I think pretty soon I'd be able to pick up the language again.
A comment here, this person was in high school at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis and remembers being very concerned about a nuclear war just from hearing the president talk about it, and said there was a lot of talk uh, among friends about duck and cover and how to survive an attack on Washington. I mean, I was around then too, and we were all very much aware that, we were the center of the bullseye if something really bad happened.
Well, that is certainly true. The U.S., as I said, the U.S., you see, what happened on that Sunday, which was so remarkable, was that if Khrushchev had not bent and broken on that Sunday, on Monday morning, the United States was prepared to attack Cuba. There were troops ready to go into Cuba. There were planes ready to bomb Cuba. And the war would have begun. It would have started with conventional weapons, but immediately shifted to nuclear if either side felt jeopardized. And in a way, the glory of the day was that Khrushchev came. And it's interesting, Kennedy got word to me in Moscow by way of the White House press officer to the CBS Washington bureau chief to me that they did not like my use of the word cave. They believed that I should not have used a word like that because they did not want Khrushchev to be even more cornered than he already was. They didn't want him to feel additionally embarrassed. And so they got the word to me, but I continued to use it because I felt then, as I do now, it was not the only verb that I used. Capitulated was another, gave in was another. But he really didn't like that word, and but so be it. I mean, that's some of the things, minor conflicts between a journalist and a president.
When you talked about that incident earlier, you said this was something that Putin would never do. Admit he
Yes.
was wrong and change course. And we got a comment here that they suspect that's because, unlike Khrushchev, who was surrounded by rivals and potential rivals, Putin really doesn't have anybody, vying to take over. He's eliminated all of his rivals. You have
So
any
far as
thoughts on
we
that?
know,
Yeah.
so far as we know, he has eliminated his rivals. You only learn in a dictatorship, you only learn about rivals after they rise to the surface. And then you look back and you say, ah, yes, he was a rival a year ago. He disagreed with the government on economic policy. That's all post facto. We do not know the kind of opposition that Putin faces on a daily basis. My own gut feeling, and that is all it is, my own gut feeling is that there are many centers of rivalry in the Kremlin now, but Putin manages still to contain all of them. He manages still to remain the ultimate authority in Russia. He's the boss. But it
So
is impossible for us on the outside to look in and to know what is going on. If the United States has listening devices in the Kremlin today, as it did have years ago, great. But that is obviously a super top secret operation, and not going to share that with anybody, and shouldn't. But my gut feeling is that Putin, as an individual, as a kind of Russian leader, would not have done what Khrushchev did. And we would be, I fear, in a terrible mess right now. I believe, again, this is personal, I have no inside knowledge. I believe that Putin is more vulnerable today than he's ever been. And one indication is that he is allowing 10, 12,000 North Korean troops to come help him fight against the Ukrainians. That's public. That's an acknowledgement to the Russian people that they on their own can't beat the Ukrainians, who have only 1/3 the population of Russia. A leader is questioned, but when you are a dictator, as Putin is, you're not questioned in public. That is something for the kitchen table, if even there.
Okay, next question, changing topics. Do you have any experiences that relate to Strobe Talbot?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've known Stroh for many, many, many years. He lives up in New York now. He was, for a long stretch of time, the president at Brookings. Before that, he did work for the Clinton administration. Strobe and Clinton were friends that go back to their days at Oxford. Strobe is a very accomplished writer and expert on Russia. He did some of or perhaps even all of the translation of Khrushchev's biography, autobiography. Yeah, I do. I know it's true.
And from your perspective, what effect will Trump and his love for Putin have over the next 4 years on the U.S.-Russia relationship and on the war in Ukraine?
Well, I thank you for the question. I don't know the answer to that. I am not sure about what Putin might have on Trump or what Trump might have on Putin. But I do know that what it is that Trump decides is going to have a powerful effect on our relationship with Russia, the ending of the Ukraine war, the way in which the Israeli-Arab relationship is somehow resolved, that the constant tensions and wars in the Middle East can be eased, that whole problem eased, and of course the relationship that we have with China. Trump has already indicated, and we know it from the way he operated in his first time in office, he's already indicated that there will be what he keeps calling major changes. On the economic side, he has already given us an indication. There is going to be an imposition of high tariffs on many imported goods. What the president-elect appears unable to either recognize or understand is that the higher the tariffs, the more will be the cost of that imported goods. And so the American people are going to feel that. And there's going to be hurt on the domestic economic side as a consequence. And there's going to be anger on the part of many of our allies. And there could be the beginning of a trade. These things happen every now and then, but they're ended very quickly because both sides recognize they're only hurting themselves. We are at a possible turning point in American domestic politics, the turning point in the sense that we have recognized that we are a tender democracy for 247 years now. And we'd like to believe that we will continue along that path. I want to believe that we will continue along that path. But if I had to bet on it, it's no better than 50-50 at this point.
Okay, next question is, do you think that Putin's posturing about the use of nuclear weapons, especially against Ukraine, is just posturing, or is it something serious to be concerned about?
It is definitely something to be seriously concerned about. And for one crucial meeting, I remember once an Israeli leader, Golda Meir, told me that Israel would never use nuclear weapons unless she felt Israel was going under, then you use them. If Putin likewise feels, not that Russia is going under, but that his rule is going under, that he might lose power. Yes, I think it is entirely possible that he would begin to use small tactical nuclear weapons, and he would rationalize it to himself and to the world that these were very small tactical nukes. But he is fooling no one. When any country, since the United States used nuclear weapons in 1945, they have never been used in wartime. If you break that condition, you are putting the world on a totally new path. Is it possible that there would be a nuclear war? You have to say, yes, it's always possible. But all sides up to this point have chosen to take steps to sort of put it on a back shelf. Putin has moved it to the front of the shelf. That doesn't mean he's going to use it, but they are there to be used if he felt he had to.
Okay. Do you think the role of the media today is different than it was when you were working at CBS?
You bet. You bet. Big time. It is very different indeed. Different in technology and different in political position. That's a strange term for me to use. When I was at CBS and at NBC, I was there for 30 years. I think when I say the following, that I am saying only what 99% of reporters believe. They were there to cover the news. They were not there to be part of the news. If you cover the news, you were sort of above it, looking down. You can spot people, you can do various things, but you were not part of the warfare. Today, with the emergence in technology of Fox and all of the little foxes, you have the media writ large split into two parts. One part is the Fox world, which is very big and very powerful. I just read something this morning, in fact, that of the three cable networks, CNN, ABC, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, Fox gets 73% of the viewing audience. 73%. So keep that in your mind in terms of potentially political power as well as journalistic power. But the world of journalism is now split in half. And there's one part, like Fox, which is actively, wittingly part of the political warfare of the day. And then there are the other news organ, New York Times, the Post, Wall Street Journal, Chicago Trib, Dallas Morning News, the three big networks that are still part of that other world, but that world is changing also. And if it should be that the new administration chooses, as threatened, to take action against the press, you will see it first taking action against independent radio stations and television stations around the country. All of these stations make up the totality of a network. You cannot take action against CBS, but you can take action against CBS affiliate stations. If the new administration takes action of that sort, which they have threatened to do, that other part of the media world that I spoke of, the Times, etc., will begin to fracture. If it begins to fracture, it will weaken. And if the press weakens in that sense, so too will the democracy of this country. So I go back, it's a 50-50 chance right now as to what is going to happen. My hope, this is sort of silly to say, I guess, but my hope is that the new administration will prove to be as chaotic and ineffective as it was the first time around. And if it be that, there will still be a price that the country will pay, because to be ineffective means the economy will begin to go down and it will affect people all over the country. There will be a price to pay, but you may be paying the price of continuing democracy.
Okay, got a question here. Person who was at Radio Free Europe when Congress was trying to dismantle it in the early 90s because, in quotes, the Cold War was over. Little did we know then. And their question is, were there the equivalent of today's oligarchs before Putin's time, but they were just less prominent?
You mean the media side of Putin's world? I'm not sure.
No, I think the Russian oligarchs who control, vast amounts of money
Right.
and entire
The
industries.
oligarchs, they're still there.
No,
They
but
are
were
still
they
there.
there?
They are all over the place, except there is no one of sufficient power to challenge Putin directly.
Mhm.
So there are very wealthy people in Russia, and they have enormous power. And when I said earlier in talking about Putin and the political uh, competition around him, when he goes, again, in my judgment, there will be a replacement, not of the military, no intellectual. It'll be somebody like a Musk in the United States. That type of figure dealing with technology, um, dealing through the technology to the media, and through the media affecting the public. Those are the kinds of people who today in both societies are acquiring more and more power.
Okay. Someone here says his cousin used to work at CBS with Dan Rather and Walter Cronkite. His name was Michael Christian. Did you ever work with him?
No,
Okay.
I mean, that doesn't mean that Michael was not working with Cronkite. I just
Mhm.
didn't know all of the people.
Now, I will say one thing you talked about that surprised me was Khrushchev's dreams of, more cooperation and a more peaceful, productive relationship with the U.S. Because when I was growing up, he was always the big bad guy. You never heard anything positive about him. And the notion that he would really have liked to develop a more productive relationship is kind of a revelation to me.
Yeah. Well, he was Khrushchev was a very interesting man. While Stalin was alive, Khrushchev was as brutal a communist leader as anybody was. He was in charge of Ukraine, and he smashed down on them merciless. When Stalin died in March of 1953, Khrushchev and a number of other people engaged in a fight to acquire total power. The idea that you would set up a democracy never entered their minds. It was simply a matter of who would replace Stalin. And Khrushchev won. And by 1955, he was the boss. There were people around him who represented power and challenged him, but we knew about that roughly years later, not at the time. Got whiffs of it, but didn't know it completely. But in 1956, February 56, Khrushchev delivered an historically important speech in which he denounced Stalin, criticized Stalin. That was the first time Stalin had ever been criticized in public. People listening to him died of heart attacks because they could not absorb the full impact of what it is that Khrushchev was saying. But Khrushchev had the power to take on the legend of Stalin and at the same time begin to, quote, reform the Soviet system. This is something he tried but failed to do. The system outlived him. But in that period of time, he tried to improve Russia's relations with the West because he knew that Russia was backward, and he knew that it is from the West that he could probably get the kind of support that he needed. And so he reached out first to the United States, then to Germany, France, England, Italy, and began to establish trading ties, people coming into Russia, Russians going to them. None of that stuff exists with Putin today, none of that. Khrushchev was special in that sense. Don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not making a speech in favor of Khrushchev. I was alerted the other day in another book talk that I might be risking my reputation as a reporter and a scholar by saying something that Khrushchev was reaching out to the West, and that made him sort of better. I mean, that's a silly thing even to say. I mean, it's sort of like McCarthyism revisited. Khrushchev was a complicated guy, and there were parts of him that we have to recognize. And it would seem to me that in the presence of any comparison with Putin, you would see that they were two very different Russian leaders, very different. Okay.
Okay, well, it's 10 after 11. We might want to go ahead and wrap this up. We don't want to keep you too much longer.
Well, if I simply want to make the point about the book, and I know that you all expect an author to press his book and hope that you all go out and buy a copy. Obviously, I do that, and I hope that you do. What is on my mind, above and beyond that, believe it or not, this is my 17th book, and to me, and people who know me well have said that this is the best thing I've done, because in it I have expressed what I personally feel, that it's not the reporter standing back, it's the reporter opening up, and on an issue of fundamental importance for the United States. So to the degree that you guys have an interest in that issue, and I have a feeling that you all do, you wouldn't be living this close to Washington if you did. It's called A Different Russia, and God bless you all and be well, and thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Well, thank you for talking to us. I've got a number of comments in the chat that this was just an absolutely fascinating talk.
Absolutely.
People really loved it. So
Thank you all so very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Marvin, thank you so much. As you were talking, you definitely struck a chord. I remember all of those things being in high school at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and so yes, definitely all of those things were came alive again. So thank you so much, and we really appreciate your presentation today. So it's already 11:12. So thanks to everybody for attending today. We had an excellent attendance because the presenter was so interesting and dynamic. So so be sure and tune in next week. Coffee and Conversation. Dr. Helena Kazmanovich is going to talk about holiday blues, and we'll look forward to her chatting. I had her on my Aging Matters program, and so I'm sure she'll have a lot of good things to say. So be sure and tune in next week. So have a good week.